leave a message after the tone.
There is a particular silence that arrives only once in a man's life. Not the silence of an empty house, nor the silence of a phone that will not ring, but the silence that comes the instant every person in a room decides, together and without speaking, that you are already gone. I sat inside that silence on the last evening of April, in a chair I had once been proud to call mine, while 11 men I had built a kingdom for looked at the table instead of at me, and I understood with a clarity that felt almost like relief that I had been dead to them for some time before they bothered to tell me so. I want you to understand that I did not weep. I did not shout. I stood. I buttoned my coat as if the temperature of the room had simply changed, and I walked out through a lobby built from glass and my own vanity. And I did not stop walking until I no longer recognized the streets I was walking through. It was only later, in the dark of a house too large for the man left inside it, that the true violence of the evening found me, not as anger, but as memory, a memory of all the punishments available to a ruined man is the only one that never runs out of ammunition. I do not know why I went looking for her voice that night. Of all the nights I might have chosen, perhaps a man only reaches for the thing he abandoned once he has been abandoned himself. I had kept the old number active for years, told myself it was for business, for continuity, for 100 small lies I no longer needed to believe. But when I opened the account that night, half from grief and half from the particular cruelty of insomnia, I did not find business. I found her. 71 messages, spanning nearly as many months, filed away in a box marked absurdly unheard, as though the machine itself had kept better faith with her than I had. I had never in my life been afraid of a red blinking light the way I was afraid of that one. The oldest message was dated the September after I left her. I remember the date the way a man remembers the date of an accident, not because he wishes to, but because the body keeps its own calendar, separate from the mind's forgiving one. I pressed the small triangle that would let her speak, and the 7 years between us collapsed into nothing at all. Her voice, when it came, was younger than I remembered allowing myself to remember. Julian, it's Ren. A pause. The particular pause of a woman deciding whether a sentence is worth finishing. I don't know why I'm calling a number I know you won't answer. I suppose some part of me still believes that if I say a thing out loud, it becomes less true to carry alone. Another pause. Longer. I hope wherever you've gone to become someone else, it was worth what it cost. I hope some nights it doesn't feel like winning. I think I would rather you regret this a little, Julian, than have gotten away with it clean. The message ended. I sat in a dark room in a dead man's silence, and I did not move for 11 minutes because I understood all at once that a woman had been speaking into a void for years, and the void had been me, and I had let her. I will tell you plainly, because there is no elegant way to arrive at it. I left Wren Calloway on the 9th of June, 7 years before the night my empire folded its hands and asked me quietly to leave. I did not leave her for another woman, nor for any failure of love between us. I left her because she was a modest, steady thing, and I had just been handed the first real proof that I might become an immodest, towering one, and I mistook the second for a higher form of the first. I told myself, in the particular language men use to forgive themselves in advance, that I was not leaving love behind, only smallness. I did not understand, not truly, until the night 11 men looked at a table instead of at me. That smallness and love had never been the same thing at all, and that I had confused them on purpose, because it was easier to build a kingdom than to stay and be merely sufficiently happy. I listened to 14 more messages before dawn. I will not recount them all to you now. Some things a man is permitted to keep, even from the telling of his own ruin. But I will tell you what moved through me as her voice moved through the dark of that house. Not nostalgia, which is soft and forgivable, but something closer to dread, because with every message I could hear a woman changing, growing quieter in some places and harder in others, the way a coastline changes under years of the same patient water. And I understood that somewhere in that shifting voice was a version of Wren Calloway I had never met. A woman shaped by 7 years I had no part of. 7 years that had happened to her the way weather happens to a house, whether or not anyone is home to witness it. By the 9th message, dated some 14 months after I left, her voice had stopped addressing the man I had been, and started addressing whoever I might be becoming instead. I read about the round you closed, she said, and there was no anger in it, which frightened me more than anger would have. Congratulations, Julian. I mean that, though I suspect you would believe I do. I always thought you'd be extraordinary. I just didn't think extraordinary would look like this. Like a man photographed in rooms with no windows, standing very straight, smiling like it's being asked of him. A breath. I hope somebody in one of those rooms loves you the way you wanted to be loved. I hope it wasn't only ever the room that loved you back. I put the phone down after that one. I poured a drink I did not finish, and I understood with the particular vertigo of a man standing at the edge of something he cannot yet name, that I had spent 7 years building a monument to a man Ren Calloway had already quietly stopped waiting for, and that some part of me had built it anyway, as if a monument built loudly enough might reach a woman who had gone silent on purpose. I did not listen to the rest that night. I told myself it was restraint. It was, I think now, only fear. The old animal kind. The kind that does not knock before it enters a house. The days that followed the board's decision arrived with the particular indignity of a slow bleeding rather than a clean wound. There were calls I did not take, and calls that took me instead. Lawyers speaking in the careful, bloodless language of men paid to describe a fire without ever once using the word. There were headlines which I will not recite to you, because a man's ruin, once it is public, ceases to belong to him at all. And I have decided I will keep at least this much for myself. I will only say that the name I had spent a decade building into something resembling permanence became, within the space of 9 days, a word other people used to describe a warning. I stopped answering my own door. I stopped, for the most part, answering anything. And yet each night, in the particular privacy of a house grown too quiet to bear, I returned to the box marked unheard, and I listened to one more message. As a man rations water he suspects will not be replenished, I told myself I was simply finishing what I had started. I understand now that I was doing something far more dangerous than that. I was building, message by message, a woman out of fragments, and falling toward her the way a man falls toward the one steady light left in a house whose other rooms have all gone dark. It was the 22nd message, dated some 4 years into her silence, that undid whatever restraint I had left. I drove past the old apartment today, she said, and her voice had changed again, steadier now, but with a low current beneath it, like a river that has learned to run quiet over dangerous stone. I don't know why. I tell myself I was simply in the neighborhood, though I no longer have any business being in that neighborhood at all. I stood outside for longer than a reasonable woman should have. I kept thinking, if I had known that morning that it was the last morning, would I have said something different? Would I have made you stay by force of better words? I have decided, Julian, after some years of turning it over, that I would not have. I have decided some men cannot be kept by better words. They can only be lost more gracefully. A long pause, then quieter. I have gotten quite good at losing you gracefully. I would like you to know that I did not come cheap. I sat with the phone against my chest for a long while after that message ended, as though it were a wound I could press closed with my own hand. And I want to tell you honestly, because I have decided, in the ruin of everything else, that honesty is the last inheritance I have left to give. That in that moment I did not think of my company or my name or the 11 men who had looked at a table instead of at me. I thought only of a woman, standing outside an apartment that no longer had any claim on her, losing a man gracefully, alone, in a neighborhood she had no business being in. And I understood that I loved her still, not as a memory, but as a live and terrible thing. The way a man loves a fire he has already been burned by, carefully and completely, and against every instruction his body has given him. I did not sleep that night. Instead, sometime after 3 in the morning, I did the only reckless thing left available to a man who had already lost everything a reckless act might have cost him. I called the number back. It rang only once. "Wren," I said, before she could speak, before I could lose whatever thin nerve had carried me this far. "It's Julian. I know it has been a long time. I know I have no right to the sound of your voice tonight, of every night. But I have been listening to all of it, to years of it, and I find I cannot go on pretending I have not heard you, when the truth is, I have heard nothing else in 9 days. I do not know what I am asking of you. I only know that everything I built to replace you has been taken from me in a single week, and the only voice left standing in the wreckage of it is yours, and I would rather hear you tell me to leave you alone forever than spend one more night in a house choosing on my own to imagine what you might say. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I thought, with a dread that arrived like cold water, that she had already hung up, and I would never know it. Then, at last, quietly, in a voice I had spent 7 years failing to forget. "Hello, Julian. And in those 2 words I heard, for the first time in nearly a decade, the sound of a door I had shut myself opening again. Not wide, not kindly, but open all the same. And some part of me, the part that had already lost everything else worth losing, understood before she said another word that I was about to learn precisely what it costs a man to be let back into a room he was never, in any way that mattered, entitled to leave. Hello, Julian. 2 words, and I understood in the silence that followed them that a man can be resurrected and sentenced in the very same breath. I did not answer at once. I could not. I sat in a house grown enormous with my own ruin. The phone pressed so hard against my ear that I would find later a faint red crescent left behind by it, as though even my body wanted proof that this had actually happened and had not been some final, merciful hallucination brought on by 9 days without proper sleep. Ren, I said finally, and her name in my own mouth sounded foreign to me, the way a word does when you have said it silently to yourself so many times that saying it aloud feels like trespassing. I did not think you would answer. I almost didn't. Her voice was steady, but beneath the steadiness, I could hear something else moving. Not quite fear, not quite anger. Something closer to a woman standing very still at the edge of a decision she has not yet finished making. I let it ring twice before I answered, Julian. I want you to know that. I let it ring twice because some part of me was still deciding whether I was the kind of woman who picks up a call from a man who left her without a word 7 years ago at 3 in the morning, because his empire fell down around him, and mine was the only number left standing in the wreckage. And what kind of woman are you? I asked. Now that you've decided. I don't know yet, she said. I only know I picked up. I am not certain that tells either of us anything good. I laughed, not from humor, but from the particular relief of hearing her be exact with me, the way she had always been exact, even when I had least deserved it. You were always more honest with me in a single sentence than I managed to be with myself in a decade. That was never a compliment, Julian. When I said it 7 years ago, I am not certain it's meant as one now. I did not take it as one. I took it as the truest thing anyone has said to me in 9 days. A pause, and then, because the hour and the ruin had stripped from me whatever pride I might once have had hidden behind. I have been listening to you, Wren, for days now. Every message. I did not call to explain myself or to ask anything of you tonight beyond permission to keep listening. I called because I no longer know how to be a man who does not hear your voice at the end of the day. And I have only just discovered that I was that man for 7 years. And I don't know how I survived it. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I began with the particular dread of a man who has just handed someone the whole of himself to count the seconds. When she spoke again, her voice had softened, though not entirely, the way ice softens at its very edge while remaining underneath, exactly as thick as it was. You should know, she said, that I am not the same woman who used to sit on that fire escape and believe every enormous thing you told her you would become. I want to be honest with you before this goes any further than a phone call at 3 in the morning. I have built a life, Julian, a quiet one. I did not build it waiting for you. I built it because I had to. Because a woman cannot simply stop living on the theory that the man who left her might one day come back changed. I would not ask you to have waited. I said, I have no right to that. And I think even the man I was 7 years ago, arrogant as he was, would have known better than to ask it. I am only asking to know you now, whatever that costs me, whatever it turns out I don't deserve to hear. That is a dangerous thing to offer a woman, Julian. An open invitation to tell you everything. Her voice had a faint, careful warmth in it now. The first I had heard since she picked up the phone. You may find you asked for more truth than a ruined man in the middle of the night can actually carry. I have very little left to carry, I said. I find the weight of you would be a mercy compared to everything else I am carrying tonight. She was quiet again, and then softer. Ask me something then, something small. I am not ready for the large questions yet. I don't think either of us is at this hour. But I will answer something small if you ask it honestly. Do you still keep the porch light on? I asked. The way you used to, even when no one is coming home. I heard her breath catch very slightly on the other end of the line. The sound of a small question landing somewhere she had not expected to be touched that night. Yes, she said. I still keep it on. I told myself for years it was only habit. I think now some part of me kept it on in case anyone we used to be ever came looking for the house again. A pause. That is a very small answer to carry a great deal of weight, Julian. I will carry it carefully, I said. I find I am out of practice with anything else, but I will carry this carefully. There was a long, easy quiet on the line then, the kind that no longer needed filling, and I found myself unwilling to let it stretch too far, afraid that if I let the silence sit too long, she might remember in it all the reasons she had every right to hang up on me instead. May I ask you something in return? She said, before I could speak again. Something equally small, so we are even. Anything. Do you still hate the sound of rain on windows the way you used to? You told me once it reminded you of your mother counting money at the kitchen table over and over, as if counting it again might change the sum. I had not thought of that in years, and hearing it returned to me in her voice, unearthed so gently and so precisely, undid something in my chest I had thought long since sealed over. I had forgotten I ever told you that, I said. I am somewhat ashamed you remembered it better than I did. I remember most of what you told me, Julian. That was rather the trouble with loving you. You gave a great deal away in small, careless sentences, and then spent years afterward pretending you hadn't meant any of it. I meant all of it, I said. I simply did not yet understand that meaning a thing and building a life around it were not the same act. I thought I could keep the sentences and discard the life they belonged to. I have had 9 days now to discover exactly how wrong I was. And the rain, she said, gently returning us to her question, as though she had sensed I needed the shelter of something smaller than confession. Do you still hate it? No, I said, and found saying it that it was true. I find I have started to listen for it instead. I think some nights this week it has been the only sound in the house that did not feel like an accusation. That, she said softly, is either the beginning of healing, Julian, or the beginning of a much more dangerous kind of loneliness. I am not certain which one I am listening to. Perhaps, I said, it is both. I have found this week that very little in me arrives alone anymore. Every mercy seems to carry its ruin folded up inside it, and every ruin lately seems to carry some small mercy I did not expect. That, she said after a pause, sounds exhausting to be, Julian. It is, I admitted, but it is considerably less exhausting than it was to be nothing at all, which is what I was, I think. For most of the years, I did not have you to say true things to. We spoke like that until the sky outside my window began to grey. Not of collapse, not of headlines, not of anything either of us had lost in any way the world could measure. We spoke instead in small questions and smaller answers, the two of us relearning each other, one careful fragment at a time, like two people feeling their way along a wall in the dark, unwilling to let go of it, and unwilling either to move too quickly toward whatever waited at the end of the hallway. By the time we said good night, the true kind, spoken with the reluctance of two people who have just discovered they do not want a conversation to end, I understood that something had already begun again between us, that neither of us had agreed to out loud, and that I was, for the first time in longer than I could account for, afraid of losing something more than I was afraid of losing everything else. We spoke like that for 11 nights that followed. I will not pretend to you that the outside world had stopped happening around me during them. The lawyers continued their careful arithmetic of my ruin. The headlines continued their slow autopsy of my name, and each morning I woke to some fresh procedural humiliation. I had neither the will nor, increasingly, the interest to fully absorb. I let it happen at a distance, the way a man watches whether through a window he has decided not to open. It no longer felt like the center of my life. It had become, almost obscenely quickly, the least interesting thing about my days. The center of my life had become the hour after midnight, and the particular sound of a woman deciding, one careful fragment at a time, how much of 7 years she had trusted me to hold. On the fourth night, she asked me to say her name the way I used to, before either of us had become anyone worth writing about. And I understood that this was her small question, offered back to me in kind, the two of us trading fragile things across the distance, testing whether the other still knew how to hold them gently. Wren, I said, and let it sit in the air between us, the way I had said it on a fire escape a decade before, without the weight of empire or headline behind it, only the plain, unguarded shape of her name. There, she said quietly, that is the first time you've said it all week the way you used to. I had begun to think you'd forgotten how. I did not forget, I said. I only stopped believing I had the right to say it that way. I find tonight I no longer care whether I have the right. I am saying it anyway. She laughed, low and real. You always did save your recklessness for exactly the wrong moments, Julian Thorne. 10 years ago, it was your fortune. Tonight, apparently, it's me. Perhaps, I said, I have simply run out of anything else worth being reckless with. On the 7th night, I asked her the question I had been circling since the first. Was there someone else? I said. In the years I was gone, I asked not to torture myself with the answer, Ren, though I confess I am not above that particular vice. I ask because I find I want to know the whole shape of the woman I am speaking to, and I cannot love a silhouette. She was quiet for long enough that I thought the question had cost more than I intended it to. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, not colder, but more careful. The voice of a woman choosing her way across ice she alone knows the thickness of. There were people, Julian. I will not pretend 7 years passed with the door locked and a candle burning for a man who left without a word. That would not be honest, and I promised myself long before you called that whatever I gave you again, it would not be a lie dressed prettily, a breath. But there is a difference between people who passed through a life and the thing that actually shaped it. I am not ready to tell you which one shaped mine. I am not certain, if I am honest, that I am ready to know the answer myself before I say it aloud to you. Dread is a strange companion to desire. I had not expected, in the ruin of my fortune, to discover that the two could occupy the same hour of the same night with such perfect, terrible harmony. I wanted her in that moment with an intensity that frightened me more than any headline had, and beneath the wanting, quiet and patient as water finding the lowest point of a room, was the growing certainty that she was protecting something from me, not out of cruelty, but out of something careful, private arithmetic I could not yet see the sum of. Then I will ask you to know it before you are ready, I said. I will only ask that when you are, you tell me first, before the world, before anyone. I find I have grown greedy for very little, Wren, in the wreckage of wanting everything. I find what I want now is simply to be first in something again, even if it costs me the answer I am afraid of. That, she said quietly, might be the first entirely selfless thing I have heard you say in 10 years, Julian Thorne. Do not mistake it for selflessness, I said. I am not capable of it yet. Not fully. I only find that I would rather be second to your fear than a stranger to your truth. On the 8th night, I asked her what she had built in the years I was busy proving I was not ordinary, and she gave me, at last, the garden. She told me of tomatoes she had drowned with kindness the first summer, and starved with neglect the second, of a stubborn climbing rose that had taken 3 years to flower, and had this spring finally covered half a trellis in the color she described as the exact red of being right about something you were afraid to say out loud. She spoke for a long while, and I did not interrupt her once, because I understood, listening, that I was being given something rarer than information. I was being given the ordinary texture of life I had once been too hungry to want, and I found, to my own astonishment, that I wanted nothing else in the world so much as to hear the next unremarkable thing she might say. You've gone quiet, she said. After a silence I had not noticed stretching. I am only remembering, I said, that I once thought a life like that would be a kind of defeat. I am sitting in the wreckage of the alternative Wren, and I find I no longer recognize the man who believed that. It was on the 9th night that the poetry between us gave way, briefly, to something closer to confession, the kind a man does not offer easily, because it costs him the last clean version of himself he has been permitted to keep. I want to tell you what actually happened, I said, not the version the papers have printed, which is true in its facts and dishonest in its shape. I lied, Wren. Not extravagantly. I did not steal for the pleasure of stealing, but I built numbers that were not entirely honest, because I could not bear, even for a single quarter, to be the man who had built something ordinary. I would rather have been a liar of extraordinary things than an honest man of modest ones. I understand now that this is precisely the same failure that cost me you. I have simply been failing at the same thing, at greater and greater scale, for a decade. She did not gasp. She did not condemn me, though I had, in some private chamber of myself, wanted her to, wanted the clean absolution of her anger, which would have been easier to survive than what she gave me instead, which was silence. And then, after a long while, something worse than anger. I am not surprised, she said quietly. I think some part of me knew that the day I watched you leave. I think I have spent 7 years waiting for the day the world found out what I truly understood about you at 26. It does not make me love you less, tonight, Julian. I want you to understand that. And I want you to understand how much it frightens me to say it. It only makes me grieve a little for the version of you who might have built something honest instead. I think he would have been happier. I think perhaps I would have gotten to keep him. I sat with that sentence for a long time after the call ended, in a house that no longer felt like the center of my ruin at all, but only the waiting room outside it. Because for the first time since the night 11 men had looked at a table instead of at me, I understood that the true catastrophe of my life was not the fortune I had lost, nor the name the headlines had made a warning of. It was that a woman I had spent 7 years failing to deserve had just told me, gently and without cruelty, that she still loved the man I had been, and that the man I had become had cost her the chance to keep him.